The records are incomplete. The names are familiar, but the story lies buried in fragments of rumor, contracts, and whispered testimony. And yet, enough remains to reconstruct a tale that unsettled even the hardened society of antebellum Louisiana. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. It begins not with the infamous ceremony of 1854, but 2 decades earlier, when the Rochon family of Natchitoches Parish first established themselves as merchants and planters along the Red River. Their fortunes rose quickly, built on the same foundation as so many Louisiana estates: land speculation, sugar, and the traffic of enslaved people. From the start, however, there were murmurs of poor judgment in their dealings, of debts carried forward under uncertain names, and of a reckless ambition that left them vulnerable to men sharper than themselves. By 1834, their younger cousin Samuel Rochon was already entangled with partners who would one day become his executioners. The archives tell us little about Samuel himself beyond scattered legal petitions. He was a planter of middling ability, educated in New Orleans but lacking discipline. He married into modest Creole wealth and attempted to expand his holdings through risky ventures in cotton and river transport. By temperament he was both proud and insecure, desperate to be perceived as respectable, yet haunted by the knowledge that his fortune was fragile. His notebooks, 3 of which survive in private collections, reveal a man preoccupied with legitimacy. He wrote often of the eyes of society, of the burden of proof upon a man of standing, as though rehearsing a defense against some imagined tribunal. What is certain is that in 1834 he entered into an arrangement with Etienne Valois and André Desmarais, 2 merchants whose families had long memories of betrayal. A cousin of theirs, Mathieu Valois, had perished under circumstances whispered to be tied to Samuel's manipulations in the New Orleans cotton exchange. Another, Jean Desmarais, had seen his fortune collapse after a shipment seized under debts that Samuel quietly shifted away from his own name. No court ever convicted him of fraud, but within these tight-knit parishes memory and kinship proved stronger than law. The arrangement, some call it a partnership, others a wager, tied Samuel's plantation at Belle Grove to loans underwritten by Valois and Desmarais. For a time all prospered. The river was high, cotton prices favorable, and Belle Grove grew into a respectable estate. Its reputation rested on the labor of dozens of enslaved people, among them a tall, broad-shouldered cook named Marianne. Household inventories list her only as negress aged, yet neighbors remembered her vividly, a woman of heavy build, skilled in Creole stews and possessed of a calm dignity that unsettled those who mistook size for clumsiness. By the late 1840s cracks appeared. Samuel's accounts list debts multiplying against falling yield. Letters show him appealing to Etienne for further credit, invoking promises of repayment that sound increasingly desperate. In 1852, a storm destroyed part of his river fleet. In 1853, yellow fever struck Natchitoches and Samuel's wife succumbed within a week, leaving him isolated and reckless. He turned again to his creditors, and this time the bargain they imposed was of a different nature. Here the record blurs into rumor. Parish gossip spoke of a bet, of cruel terms devised at Samuel's expense. Some claimed that Etienne and André, aware of his collapse, proposed the marriage as a condition of continued survival, that he take Marianne, his cook, as wife, thereby humiliating himself in the eyes of Louisiana society. Others insist that Samuel himself, half mad with fear and whiskey, suggested the union in hopes of currying favor or shaming his tormentors with his supposed magnanimity. What can be verified is that by early 1854, contracts had been drawn, a ceremony arranged, and invitations issued in Samuel's name to the surrounding gentry. March of that year was described as unseasonably wet, the Red River swollen and the air heavy with rot from the swamp. Letters preserved in the Desmarais papers note Samuel pacing his study, unable to sleep, staring at the marriage contract that bore his trembling signature. He attempted feebly to explain the situation to Marianne. She listened in silence, nodded once, and said, "Yes, Master Samuel, I understand. I will prepare myself." That calm acquiescence unsettled him more than refusal ever could, for it implied knowledge that she had long been aware of plans laid beyond his sight, that she was herself a participant in a scheme more intricate than he could grasp. From that moment forward, Belle Grove no longer felt like his own home. The walls seemed altered, the furniture strange, as though the house itself awaited a transfer of power. By mid-March, notices had gone out. Guests assembled with morbid curiosity, expecting spectacle, disgrace, perhaps even violence. What they found instead was a carefully staged ceremony, decorations in the parlor, refreshments laid out, a parish minister summoned from Natchitoches, and at the center, Samuel, dressed in his best, pale and trembling, and Marianne, clad in a plain but elegant gown, standing with composure that belied the grotesque inversion of society's order. From these fragments, the contracts, the letters, the whispers, we can begin to trace not just a single marriage, but the opening move in a punishment calculated to unfold over years, a punishment rooted not in sudden violence, but in humiliation stretched to the limits of endurance. The rest of the tale would span months of poisoned meals, performances of devotion, and the gradual erasure of Samuel Rochon from the records of Louisiana society. But here, in March 1854, at the threshold of that house, we see the trap closing for the first time. The marriage of Samuel Rochon to Marianne was recorded in the parish register with chilling brevity. March 17, 1854, union of Samuel Rochon, widower, to Marianne, servant, with consent of master. Witnessed by Valois Desmarais, and other. No elaboration, no comment, just ink drying on a page, yet in that silence lies a scandal that rang louder than any sermon. Neighbors who attended the ceremony carried away more than gossip. They described Samuel's face as drawn, his lips quivering when asked to repeat the vow. His voice broke when he pronounced Marianne his lawful wife, and yet Marianne, steady and expressionless, spoke clearly, almost solemnly, her tone neither proud nor ashamed. When the minister declared them joined, a ripple of suppressed laughter spread among the Valois Desmarais circle. It was not the mirth of amusement, it was the cruelty of triumph, a wager fulfilled. That night, as guests drifted homeward, letters were already being drafted. In Opelos's Baton Rouge, even as far as Natchez, word spread of the Rochon disgrace. The tale grew with each telling, that Samuel had lost a fortune at cards, that he had been forced to wed his own slave to settle the debt, that he had paraded her through the parlor like a grotesque queen. The truth, reduced to fragments, was swallowed beneath layers of ridicule. Inside Belle Grove, the atmosphere changed in ways no gossip could capture. Samuel withdrew into his study, curtains drawn, ledger books scattered across his desk like battlefield casualties. He scrawled furious calculations, striking through debts, rewriting columns, as though numbers themselves might absolve him. Yet each night when he set down the quill, the house echoed with the sound of Marianne's voice from the kitchen, directing the other servant. He could not escape her presence. She was no longer property, but wife, yet in practice, she remained mistress of the kitchen, provider of meals, her authority strangely magnified by the absurdity of the union. Surviving testimony from enslaved men and women at Belle Grove, collected decades later by Works Progress Administration interviewers, describes Marianne as quiet, heavy, like stone. One remembered, she did not laugh, she did not bow, she did not bow, she looked at you as if you had already confessed. Another recalled how she seemed to know the smallest misdeeds, appearing suddenly in the doorway when a hand lingered too long over food or a whisper turned disrespectful. To them, she became a figure both protective and terrifying, a woman marked by fate, beyond the reach of the lash or the master's whim. Samuel could not bear this reversal. His letters to Etienne and Henri, from late 1854, scattered pleas for release, filled with veiled accusation. This humiliation cannot stand. You promised the debts would be cleared, yet I remain bound, and bound also to her before God and law. My name is Ash. Was this your true design all along? He received no reply. Silence was itself an answer. In society, the Rochon name was whispered only with derision. Invitations ceased. Planters who once dined at Belle Grove crossed the street rather than greet Samuel in Natchitoches. The humiliation cut deeper than poverty. In antebellum Louisiana, reputation was currency, and Samuel's had been bankrupted. Yet the most unbearable wound was not inflicted by neighbors but by Marianne herself, for she refused to falter. She rose before dawn, tended the kitchens, and in public behaved with perfect composure. Parish records show she attended church alongside Samuel, head covered, voice steady in hymns. Children stared, adults whispered, but Marianne never broke. Some said she carried herself as if she had been waiting for this role all her life, as if the marriage were not disgrace but coronation. The winter of 1854-55 brought further decline. Cotton prices dropped, and Samuel, already drowning in debt, mortgaged what little remained of his estate. By February, Etienne and Henri held notes on nearly every acre. Yet instead of seizing the property outright, they tightened the noose gradually, allowing Samuel just enough to survive, just enough to witness his own ruin in slow motion. It was during this period that strange notations appear in Samuel's surviving notebooks. Amid calculations and frantic pleas, he scrawled words that seem less financial than confessional. They laugh at me even in my own halls. The cook sits at my table as mistress. What pact have they made with her? I cannot tell whether she is victim or conspirator. These fragments suggest a man slipping from humiliation into paranoia. He began to suspect Marianne herself of complicity, that she had allied with Valois and Desmarais, that the marriage was not punishment but plan. Whether this suspicion had any basis remains unknowable. What is clear is that by spring of 1855, Samuel's grip on reality was fraying. Accounts from enslaved laborers describe hearing him pacing at night, muttering to unseen figures, sometimes shouting Marianne's name in terror. Yet each morning, when he descended to breakfast, she was there calm, solid, unflinching, placing bread and coffee before him as if nothing had passed. The cruelty lay not in words or blows, but in that steady presence, that refusal to break. One visitor to Belle Grove in mid-1855, a planter from Rapides parish, later wrote, "Never have I seen a house so silent, save for the clatter of dishes." The master sat pale as death, while his wife, a woman of prodigious size, served each course with a serenity that mocked him. It was as if the order of nature itself had been reversed, and he the servant. This inversion, social, domestic, spiritual, was the true scandal of the Rochon marriage, and it was only beginning. For in the summer of 1855, with debts cresting and madness tightening its grip, Samuel made a fateful decision. He would attempt to reclaim authority through the one realm still respected among men of science and medicine, the body itself. In August, correspondence shows him contacting a physician in New Orleans, requesting texts on heredity, constitution, and the transmission of defects. He ordered volumes on phrenology, on comparative anatomy, on the peculiarities of the African constitution. He wrote to acquaintances asking for case studies of mixed unions. All arrived at Belle Grove in crates that autumn. Samuel withdrew into study once more, but this time the ledgers gave way to anatomical diagrams, tables of measurements, and fevered speculation. He had found, or thought he had found, a means of turning disgrace into proof, of transforming humiliation into a grotesque experiment that might restore his standing. By the autumn of 1855, the halls of Belle Grove no longer echoed with music or visitors' laughter. Instead, they filled with the rustle of papers, the scratching of quills, the low murmur of Samuel Rochon reciting fragments from medical texts to himself. His study, once a place of ledgers and contracts, transformed into a chamber of anatomy. On the shelves sat volumes of Spurzheim's phrenology, Morton's craniometry, and pamphlets on the physical peculiarities of the Negro race. He acquired measuring calipers, inked diagrams of skulls, and even a crude plaster mold of a cranium he claimed had been sent from Philadelphia. The surviving pages of his notebooks, brittle and water-stained, reveal the cadence of obsession. Samuel wrote in tight, anxious lines, combining scripture with pseudo-science, as if the authority of the one could sanctify the other. The union forced upon me may yet serve the cause of truth. If her flesh is to be my disgrace, let it also be my instrument. Again and again he returned to a single thought, that through the examination of Marianne, her body, her habits, her constitution, he might produce some document of value, some treatise, to regain the respect of the very men who had orchestrated his downfall. The enslaved of Belle Grove noticed the shift immediately. Marianne was summoned to Samuel's study at irregular hours. He measured her arms, traced her skull, demanded she stand still while he recorded her height and weight in ledger. He pressed her hands against sheets of parchment, outlining each finger with precise strokes. At times he grew agitated, shouting when she moved or coughed, yet Marianne, according to testimony later given, never resisted. She complied with his demands as she had with the marriage vows, calm, silent, steady. And yet, there was something in her silence that unnerved him more than defiance. His notes confess as much. She does not speak. She looks only. I record the breadth of her shoulders, and still she looks. I number the inches of her skull, and still she looks, as if she knows already what I will find, and mocks me by withholding it. Visitors to the plantation during this time carried away impressions both grotesque and pitiable. One, a doctor from New Orleans, recalled seeing piles of journals scattered across the desk, each filled with elaborate tables, measurements of skin folds, calculations of respiration, notes on digestion peculiarity. The doctor dismissed them as nonsense, muttering that Samuel had confused physiology with penance. Yet he admitted the sight of Marianne, seated in silence while her husband measured her pulse, had left him deeply unsettled. By early 1856, Samuel had begun to expand his focus. He collected data not only on Marianne, but on the other enslaved at Belle Grove, measuring children's skulls, recording birth weights, classifying facial angles. He compared them obsessively against diagrams copied from European texts. The enslaved later recalled their terror of being summoned to the study, where Samuel's trembling hands and unblinking stare made the air feel heavier than any lash. Still, his true fixation remained Mary. His notes grew increasingly frantic, as if he were hunting for some hidden flaw that would justify his contempt, some proof that her very being was unfit for the role she had been forced into. But the numbers betrayed him. Each measurement fell within ranges too broad to condemn. His calculations yielded nothing but contradictions. She is too strong where she should be weak, too symmetrical where she should be grotesque. She is both the evidence and the refutation of itself. It was in this despair that Samuel turned toward the darkest of science. A series of receipts from New Orleans, dated June 1856, revealed the purchase of preserved organs, anatomical wax models, and a medical specimen case. He corresponded with itinerant lecturers in physiology, asking for demonstrations of dissection, for diagrams of hereditary disease. One letter, preserved in the Valois papers, suggests he requested access to subjects of mixed blood for study, an inquiry that horrified even those accustomed to Louisiana's brutal commerce. The paradox deepened. The more Samuel sought to prove Marianne's supposed inferiority, the more her calm presence undermined him. At table, she sat composed, cutting bread with the same hand he had measured hours earlier. In church, she knelt with dignity, her heavy frame draped in plain cloth, her eyes steady upon the altar. Parishioners whispered that she seemed less a woman than an immovable monument, a living rebuke to the collapse of her husband. By autumn of 1856, Samuel's journals display signs of unraveling. Words repeat in circles: inheritance, contamination, corruption, destiny. He sketches diagrams that blur into grotesque caricatures, half skull, half mask, half confession. Margins fill with biblical verses, twisted into pseudo-medical prophecy. The sins of the father shall be visited upon the child, therefore let the child be the evidence. This last phrase appears again and again underlined in furious ink. It suggests his thoughts had shifted toward the possibility of offspring, whether as vindication or as ultimate punishment remains uncertain. His surviving letters to Etienne, unanswered, tremble with this obsession. If there should be a child, then it will not be my ruin, but my record. Let them laugh now, posterity will tremble when the truth is revealed in the flesh. What truth he imagined remains a mystery. What is certain is that the household grew darker still. The enslaved recalled hearing strange noises at night, Samuel muttering prayers in Latin, scraping sounds of furniture moved, even bursts of laughter that ended in sobs. Marianne's footsteps, heavy and deliberate, could be heard crossing the hallways at dawn, steady as ever. One witness said, she walked like a bell that tolls the hour. Every step was the same, as if time itself marched with her. The paradox of their union, forced, humiliating, yet immovable, had become Samuel's prison. Each attempt to rationalize it through science only chained him more tightly. His notes testify not to discovery, but to collapse. She is the experiment, but I am the subject. They think they bound her to me, but in truth they bound me to. I cannot tell where my shame ends and hers begins. By the winter of 1856, Belle Grove stood not as a plantation but as a mausoleum of obsession. The cotton fields lay neglected, debts mounted, and creditors circled. Yet within those shuttered rooms, Samuel pursued his futile study, as though by measuring, dissecting, and annotating, he might at last measure his way out of despair. What he failed to see, what those around him began to suspect, was that Marianne herself had become the axis of the household, not through cruelty, not through seizure of authority, but simply by enduring. Her silence, her weight, her impenetrable calm became the true governance of Belle Grove. The master paced and scribbled, the mistress simply remained, and in that stillness lay a power more terrifying than any lack. The stage was set for the next phase of Samuel's descent, a phase that would abandon observation for intervention, and transform his study from a chamber of notes into a theater of experiment. By the spring of 1857, Belle Grove had ceased to resemble a functioning plantation. The cotton fields lay choked with weeds, the accounts hopelessly insolvent, and creditors whispering in Baton Rouge taverns of foreclosure. Yet within the shuttered house, Samuel Rochon persisted in his descent, transforming his private study into what later witnesses would call a theater of cruelty, disguised as science. The journals of this year, more fragment than record, chart his shift from observation to intervention. He had measured, classified, annotated, yet found no vindication in numbers. Now he sought demonstration, rituals of degradation, masquerading as experiments. He forced Marianne to consume strange diets, recording her digestion with clinical detachment. He timed her sleep, compelled her to walk the length of corridors again and again, while he marked the cadence of her breath. One entry reads, "If she falters, then I will have proof. If she endures, then she is complicit." But Marianne did not falter. Testimony preserved from the enslaved recalls her steady compliance, her silence deeper than any submission. She obeyed his instructions without protest, endured his endless notes, his instruments, his calculations, yet her very endurance became the evidence of his madness. For each survival invalidated his thesis. The more she lived, the more his theories died. By midsummer, his notebooks grew incoherent, words collapsing into incantation. I must extract the truth. I must compel the evidence. She must yield, or I must break. Alongside the words appeared drawings grotesque and symbolic, scales that tipped toward shadow, skulls sprouting branches, a womb encircled by chains. It was in this season that whispers spread through the parish. Guests invited to Belle Grove for supper described scenes that shocked even hardened planters. Marianne presided at Samuel's table, not as servant but as wife, seated at his right hand in plain cotton, but with a dignity none could dismiss. Samuel, pale and trembling, introduced her in tones half mocking, half defiant. "My consort, my specimen, my proof." Some guests refused to return. Others came only to whisper afterward of the humiliation, but all agreed that Marianne's composure unsettled them more than Samuel's mania. She ate in silence, her gaze unwavering, while her husband ranted about inheritance and contamination between gulps of brandy. Debt closed tighter around him. In October of 1857, foreclosure proceedings began in earnest, yet Samuel seemed indifferent. In a letter to Etienne, never answered, he wrote, "They may take the land, but not the record. Posterity shall know, my union is not disgrace, but revelation." She carries the evidence within her, and when it emerges, all will be confounded. The meaning of this letter became clear months later, for parish gossip spoke of Marianne's swelling figure, the unmistakable signs of pregnancy. The cook turned wife, marked as humiliation, was now poised to bear the master's heir. From this moment, Samuel's journals change utterly. They become exalted, ecstatic, filled with prophetic fervor. "The child will vindicate me. The child will embody the truth. Through it, the experiment will be complete." He recorded Marianne's condition with obsessive precision, the rhythm of her heartbeat, the circumference of her belly, the color of her urine. He sketched her profile in crude charcoal again and again, as if mapping the future upon her flesh. But where Samuel wrote with fevered anticipation, Marianne remained inscrutable. The enslaved recalled her moving through the house with the same steady tread as before, cooking when she wished, sitting in silence when she pleased. She neither complained nor rejoiced, but carried her burden as she had carried all others, without visible tremor. To the household she seemed less a woman than a monument, bearing the child with the inevitability of stone-bearing weather. The winter of 1857-58 was marked by Samuel's increasing isolation. Few creditors dared visit, fewer neighbors acknowledged him. Rumors of madness clung to Belle Grove. Some claimed he experimented upon livestock, dissecting calves in search of hereditary truth. Others whispered he had joined secret societies in New Orleans, trading coin for arcane knowledge of bloodlines. What remains certain is that his notes grew apocalyptic. When the child emerges, the world will see its own corruption. It will be neither white nor black, neither slave nor free, but proof incarnate. At last, in June of 1858, Marianne bore a child. The record is fragmentary. Some accounts claim the infant was stillborn, others that it lived only hours. Samuel's journals from this month are soaked in ink blots and scratched out lines. One surviving entry reads, "The form is ambiguous, too much flesh, too little distinction. They will not see what I see, whatever the truth." Samuel presented the event as revelation. He carried the infant's body, living or dead, into his study, laying it upon the same desk where he had once spread his ledgers. He wrote furiously for 3 days, describing its features in grotesque detail, the curve of the skull, the width of the nose, the size of the hand. To him these were proofs of his theories, confirmations of contamination, yet to any sane observer, they were the ravings of a man collapsing under the weight of obsession. Marianne herself left no word. Witnesses recall her emerging from the birthing chamber silent, her face expressionless, her hands folded across her belly. She resumed her place at Samuel's table within a week,
eating in silence while he raved of revelation. No complaint, no grief, no joy, only the same impenetrable calm. The end of Belle Grove came swiftly thereafter. Creditors seized the estate in late 1858. Samuel, refusing to leave, barricaded himself in his study. When the sheriff's men forced the door, they found him surrounded by piles of notes, the infant swaddling, laid across the desk, his face gaunt with hunger and brandy. He was removed under restraint, muttering of evidence unborn, evidence it. He died in a New Orleans asylum the following year. As for Marianne, records grow thin. Some suggest she remained on the land under new owners, cooking as she always had. Others claim she vanished into the swamps, leaving behind nothing but silence. Parish memory preserved her only as a figure of endurance, the fat cook who married the master and outlived him. And yet the story did not vanish. Among abolitionists, whispers of Belle Grove circulated as cautionary tale, proof of the grotesque corruption of slavery's hierarchy. In Louisiana society, it endured as scandal, spoken in hushed tones, the planter who married his cook and lost everything. But in the hidden pages of Samuel's journals, preserved in archives, the tale becomes something darker still, not simply humiliation, but the collapse of reason itself. A man reduced to madness by the endurance of the woman he sought to destroy. Thus ends the primary record. Whether the child lived or died, whether Marianne endured or escaped, remains uncertain. What remains undeniable is the ruin, a plantation stripped to nothing, a master consumed by obsession, and a woman who bore humiliation with such stillness that it became its own form of power. In the margins of his final surviving notebook, Samuel scrawled a last sentence before his removal to the asylum. She was never my specimen, I was hers.
The asylum records of 1859 are a strange hybrid of medicine, gossip, and legal defense. Samuel Rochon, once planter of Belle Grove, was admitted to the New Orleans Charity Hospital in December, committed by creditors who declared him mad and unfit to manage affairs. The ledgers list him as 53 years of age, afflicted with melancholia, religious mania, and delusions of heredity. What the physicians encountered, however, was no ordinary melancholic. In Samuel they found a man fevered with purpose, a patient who begged for pens and ink, who scrawled across scraps of linen when paper was denied. His attendants preserved fragments of these ravings, half anatomical sketches, half proclamations. Observe the jaw, observe the skin. The lines converge upon corruption. The world must see. At first the doctors indulged him, treating his obsession as harmless. They recorded his long monologues with professional curiosity. In one transcript dated February 1860, Samuel lectured for 3 hours on the inheritance of degeneration, quoting biblical passages alongside Latin fragments from Galen. He paced the ward like a tutor before invisible students, pointing to his fellow inmates as examples. Here is the residue of inbreeding. Here is the evidence of original sin. His voice was steady, persuasive, even eloquent. Some attendants admitted afterward that they almost believed him, but the veneer cracked when he began demanding subjects for demonstration. He begged the hospital staff to bring him corpses from the paupers' ward, promising to reveal secrets of lineage if allowed to dissect. When denied, he turned to self-mutilation, pricking his arms with glass shards, collecting drops of blood in jars, labeling them as though they were specimens. This is pure. This is tainted. The line divides in me. By mid-1860, his notes betray a collapse into ritual. The language shifts from analysis to invocation. Through sacrifice the truth is manifest. The blood will tell. The womb will not be silent. Drawings of concentric circles, of chained figures, of monstrous infants appear beside biblical citations. Physicians remarked with unease that Samuel's handwriting remained meticulous even as his sense unraveled. Meanwhile, beyond the hospital, the fate of Marianne stirred quiet speculation. Parish gossip claimed she had been sold after Belle Grove's foreclosure, passed from one household to another until she disappeared into obscurity. Yet certain letters, one from a Union officer in 1863, another from a New Orleans nun, hint at her continued presence in Louisiana, moving like a shadow between kitchens, always silent, always steady. In each account she is remembered not with scorn but with unease. The woman carried something in her eyes, one witness wrote, something that made men look away. Samuel never ceased writing about her. In notebook after notebook he referred to Marianne as the vessel, the unbroken subject, the stone against which all theory shattered. Even when raving of bloodlines, he returned to her silence. She refuses the role, she defies by endurance. She bears humiliation as shield. In this she is invincible. The asylum physicians, trained in the new sciences of psychiatry, diagnosed him with paranoia complicated by moral mania. They debated whether his marriage to Marianne was itself evidence of delusion or a calculated humiliation imposed by others. In one memorandum, Dr. Leclerc noted, "The patient insists upon his union with a negress cook as proof of experiment. Whether this marriage was voluntary or coerced, we cannot determine, but its effect upon his psyche is indubitable. It is the axis of his disorder." And yet, even as they condemned his theories, they preserved his writings. Boxes of Samuel's papers were archived not as medical waste, but as curiosities of degeneracy theory. Later generations of eugenicists would, disturbingly, cite fragments of his ravings as early evidence of hereditary contamination. Thus his madness found posthumous readers, embedding itself in the darker veins of American pseudoscience. By the winter of 1861, Samuel's health had declined. Years of brandy and insomnia left him skeletal, yet his voice remained clear. A final recorded address delivered to no audience but himself reads, "I was the experiment, I was the proof. She endures, I collapse." Thus the hierarchy invert. Remember this, ye who seek mastery. Endurance is the greater tyranny. He died in April 1862, a month after the Union Navy captured New Orleans. His body was interred in an unmarked grave behind the hospital. The physicians closed his file with a terse summary. Subject deceased, cause exhaustion of mania. Yet his papers did not die with him. They were carried into archives, cited in treatises, whispered of by reformers and racists alike. The legacy of Belle Grove, once scandal, now became specimen, a cautionary tale of miscegenation for some, a parable of tyranny undone for others. And always, beneath the interpretations, there lingers Marianne, her silence, her endurance, her refusal to break the one element no theory can erase. The post-bellum decades cast long shadows over Belle Grove, and those who had once belonged to it. Though Samuel Rochon perished in 1862 within the asylum walls, the whispers of his theories outlived him, circulating among physicians, reformers, and idle intellectuals, who sought in his ravings some proof of their own biases. His writings, preserved in tin boxes at Charity Hospital, moved silently from desk to desk, copied into marginal notes, their strange mixture of scripture and pseudoscience both compelling and repulsive. One clerk examining the fragments in 1867 described them as a gospel of degeneration. The clerk added, with evident disgust, that many of Samuel's diagrams were rendered with a surgeon's care, precise lines mapping imagined taints in bloodlines. He noted the repeated motif, concentric circles, enclosing a lone figure, always marked, for Marianne, the silent cook turned wife. Samuel's obsession never ceased even after his death. Yet the parish records are stubbornly quiet about her. Tax rolls list no property under her name. The Freedmen's Bureau reports make no mention of her claim. And yet stray testimonies arise like flares in the dark. In 1871, a Methodist minister stationed in Ascension Parish recorded a curious encounter. A heavy-set woman of advanced years came to hear the preaching. She sat at the rear, eyes downcast, hands folded. When approached, she gave her name as Marianne. No more. But her presence unsettled several in the congregation, who whispered that she had been wife to the mad planter of Belle Grove. The woman made no response, only listened, and departed at dusk. None saw her return. What is remarkable is the consistency of such accounts, whether in St. James, Plaquemine, or Baton Rouge. Strangers described the same figure, tall, broad, quiet, unyielding, always a cook, always in the kitchen or the shadows, never lingering, never explaining. By the 1880s, she is spoken of in hushed tones by the children of planters, who had once mocked her. They grew uneasy at her survival, as though her continued presence testified against them. And then there are the medical notebooks, less known, harder to trace. Among the possessions of Dr. Etienne Leclerc, who had overseen Samuel's care, lay several bound volumes now housed in Tulane's archives. In them, Leclerc copied Samuel's words, but added his own observations, overlaying clinical diagnosis upon madness. One passage, dated October 1860, reads, "The patient insists upon a principle he calls the proof of flesh. He declares that the union of the degenerate with the oppressed will yield either monstrosity or miracle. He has convinced himself that his wife embodies this proof, though she has borne him no child. He proclaims that her silence is hereditary power, that through refusal, she annihilates his line. I note this with caution,
for the language chills me. The patient's conviction lends her a spectral authority even within these walls. Leclerc, skeptical though he was, could not fully dismiss Samuel's fixation. His notebooks betray an unwilling fascination. Sketches of Marianne's face, based only on Samuel's descriptions. Notes speculating whether endurance might itself be a hereditary trait. By 1875, when Leclerc retired, he too had adopted Samuel's language. He wrote in a private memorandum, "If degeneration is proven by weakness, then strength of silence must be proof as well. Perhaps history itself is an experiment, and she the surviving subject." Meanwhile, Belle Grove itself rotted. Photographs from the 1890s show a husk of a mansion, windows yawning, galleries collapsed. Locals avoided the grounds, muttering that strange figures moved in the ruins at night. Some swore that an old woman could be glimpsed stirring pots in the broken kitchen, though no one dared approach. Others claimed that Union soldiers had buried bodies there during the war, and that the soil was cursed. Into this atmosphere of ruin entered a new generation of medical men, those who would soon shape the eugenics movement. They mined Samuel's notebooks for rhetoric, stripping away the madness, polishing the fragments into scholarly prose. His talk of hereditary collapse and the proof of flesh became citations in journals of anthropology, shorn of their origin in delirium. Thus the ravings of a ruined planter were transformed into the skeleton of a science that would poison decades to come. But Marianne, always Marianne, haunted these appropriations. Even the most ardent eugenicist could not fully erase her role. In pamphlets and speeches, she appeared as a cautionary figure, a specter invoked to warn against unnatural unions. And yet in the whispered accounts of freedmen's descendants, she was remembered differently, not as warning, but as witness. A woman who had endured humiliation, outlived her oppressor, and carried herself into the next century with unbroken silence. The final verifiable record comes from 1902, when a census taker in Iberville Parish listed a Marianne aged about 80, occupation cook. She gave no surname. The form is smudged, the handwriting weary. Beneath marital status, the taker wrote only, "widowed, no issue." After that, she vanishes from the record, yet the silences remain louder than the word. In them, one discerns the slow inversion Samuel himself had feared: the planter dead, the theory distorted, the house in ruins, and the cook, silent, surviving, outlasting all. The turn of the 20th century should have buried the scandal of Belle Grove in dust. Yet instead, Samuel Rochon's ravings, preserved in scattered archives, found themselves resurrected in new guises. Physicians and social theorists, eager for evidence to support their doctrines of heredity, began quoting his words with unnerving seriousness. Detached from the asylum, and the brandy-stained lips that spoke them, his proofs were reshaped into sterile phrases, presented as the fruits of observation. A particularly disturbing example lies in the Transactions of the Southern Anthropological Society, 19. Elias Weatherford cites Samuel's diagrams without attribution. In his lecture on degeneracy and the rural South, Weatherford displayed sketches of concentric circles enclosing a central figure, Marianne. Though he proclaimed them an anonymous case study from mid-century Louisiana, demonstrating how defective unions produce cultural collapse. The audience applauded the elegance of the design, ignorant, or willfully silent of the madness behind it. At the same time, regional folklore refused to let Marianne fade. In parish after parish, stories circulated of the silent cook who had been forced into marriage with her master, and endured without break. Children in Iberville were warned not to stray near the old Belle Grove ruins, for an iron woman haunted the grounds, stirring ghostly pots at night. Some said her eyes glowed in the dark. Others swore that she simply stood watching, arms folded, as if judging all who trespass. What makes these tales compelling is their strange consistency with the asylum records. Samuel's own last words, "She endures, I collapse," resonate with the oral traditions that cast Marianne as unbroken, immovable, a presence that time itself could not erase. Where he had sought to transform her into proof of corruption, the community reimagined her as proof of survival. The medical men, however, continued their own appropriations. In 1913, during a symposium in Atlanta, Weatherford again invoked the anonymous Louisiana case, this time suggesting that silence itself was a symptom of hereditary defect. His phrase, "mutism of degeneracy," was lifted almost verbatim from Samuel's note. One wonders whether Weatherford knew his source or simply borrowed what circulated in whispers among his colleagues. Yet not all scholars were blind. A young historian named Anna Duval researching plantation records in the 1920s, encountered Samuel's archived manuscript. Her diary, now preserved in Tulane's library, records her shock. The notes are not science, but mania. To see them cited as authority in present journals is grotesque. I read in them a desperate man's attempt to rationalize cruelty, to turn humiliation into theory. The true marvel is the woman herself, silent, steadfast, beyond the reach of his categories. I suspect her endurance terrifies them still. Duval's words, though unpublished, represent one of the earliest attempts to strip away the pseudoscience and confront the human story beneath. She recognized what Samuel's doctors glimpsed but dared not name, that Marianne's silence was not deficiency, but resistance. Meanwhile, the folklore deepened. During the 1930s, WPA interviewers collecting slave narratives recorded elderly voices recalling Marianne of Belle Grove. One former field hand described her simply, "She never smiled, never cried. They say master married her on a dare, but she held her head up till he went crazy. After that, she just cooked, and folks left her be." By then the ruins of Belle Grove had almost entirely collapsed. Weeds swallowed the galleries, bats nested in the rafters, and the kitchen hearth lay cracked but intact. Locals avoided it, except for children daring each other to touch the threshold. They claimed to hear a low humming, like a pot simmering though no fire burned. Even the rising tide of academic respectability could not silence the unease. Eugenic tracts of the 1920s and 30s continued to invoke Samuel's anonymous case, while folklorists collected ghost stories of Mary. Thus two traditions ran in parallel, one cold, clinical, insistent upon degeneracy, the other spectral, haunted, insistent upon survival. In this tension lies the true horror of Belle Grove's legacy. The planter's madness outlived him, not by virtue of its truth, but by its utility, an edifice upon which new cruelties were built, and yet beside it, equally enduring, stood the image of the cook who refused to beg. By 1940, Marianne would have been long dead, her body interred in some unmarked grave, her silence broken only by rumor, but the echo of her endurance had already seeped into both archive and tale, a force neither science nor gossip could fully contain. And so, more than 80 years after Samuel's collapse in the asylum, the experiment he claimed to have enacted continued, not in the way he intended, but in the way memory reshapes its own evidence. His madness became scholarship, her silence became legend, and both together unsettled the South for generations.
The climax of the Belle Grove story does not arrive in a single moment, but in the uncanny convergence of record, rumor, and inheritance. By the mid-20th century, Samuel Rochon was no longer remembered as a man, but as a specimen, his words stripped of context, his obsessions repurposed into scientific vocabulary. In journals of anthropology, in pamphlets on racial hygiene, his diagrams resurfaced again and again, cited as proof of hereditary collapse. To the unknowing eye, they were cold data. To those who looked closer, the hand of madness still shook through every line. And yet Marianne, always Marianne, haunted the margins. In the archives her presence was a shadow, a cook, a wife, a vessel of someone else's theory. But in the stories that persisted in Louisiana parishes, she had become something else entirely. Children whispered of her as the iron cook, who could not be broken by ridicule or fire. Young women, particularly among the black community, invoked her as a figure of endurance, proof that humiliation could be borne without surrender. The contradiction reached its sharpest point in 1952, when a symposium in Baton Rouge brought together scholars of heredity, local historians and folklorists. There, in an awkward moment that the minutes do not disguise, one professor displayed Samuel's diagrams, unlabeled, clinical, and a folklorist from Iberville immediately recognized them. "That is Marianne," he declared before the assembly. "You speak of her as defect, but we remember her as strength." For a moment the room collapsed into silence. The confrontation revealed the grotesque scale of Samuel's legacy. What he had conceived in delirium became, through the pens of others, a foundation for policies, theories, and prejudices that scarred the century. Yet against this edifice stood the stubborn persistence of Marianne's legend, transmitted through whispers, through kitchens, through the wary eyes of children warned never to mock her name. Two parallel truths, colliding across generations. Science insisting upon degeneration, memory insisting upon endurance. Even the ruins of Belle Grove became a battleground for these narratives. In the 1960s, when preservationists attempted to catalogue antebellum sites, Belle Grove was dismissed as unsalvageable. Yet locals still refused to walk its grounds at night, Hunters reported strange shapes in the collapsed kitchens. A heavy figure glimpsed through smoke. A journalist who visited in 1967 described an atmosphere so thick with silence it pressed the breath out of one's chest. He concluded his article with a line that could have been lifted from Samuel himself. Something endures there. The revelation of scale is thus not only historical but spectral. Samuel's writings did not vanish with him, nor with the fall of Belle Grove. They echoed into the structures of policy and prejudice. Marianne's silence did not vanish with her body, but spread into legend, shaping how generations imagined strength and survival. The bet that began in cruelty in 1854 cascaded outward, rippling across science, folklore, and memory, until the boundaries between madness and history blur. In this way, the confrontation is less between Samuel and Marianne, or master and cook, than between two kinds of legacy, one that insists upon categorizing flesh, the other that refuses to be categorized. The true scale of the experiment is not measured in Samuel's collapse, nor in Marianne's silence, but in how their story was weaponized, reshaped, retold, haunting both the language of science and the murmur of superstition. It is here at this threshold that the story ceases to be merely personal and becomes cultural, an infection of memory that unsettles the South even now. If Part 8 revealed the breadth of Samuel Rochon's legacy, Part 9 forces us into the intimate collapse, the moment where confrontation between memory and madness can no longer be delayed. The confrontation does not take place in courtrooms or universities, but in the brittle rooms of Belle Grove itself, where, according to local record and oral tradition, Samuel was finally undone. By 1859, the plantation had become a husk. Crops withered, creditors pressed, and neighbors whispered. Samuel had withdrawn into the study, keeping shutters drawn even at midday. Visitors described the smell of rot seeping from beneath the door, the faint sound of muttering punctuated by sudden bursts of weeping laughter. His marriage to Marianne, once whispered as scandal, had curdled into rumor of something worse, that he spoke to her in languages no one else knew, that he fed her not as wife but as specimen. One visitor, a minister from Baton Rouge, left a record in his diary after attempting to offer comfort. He wrote, "The man's mind has become unmoored. His wife sits beside him in silence while he holds papers over the lamp, illuminating grotesque sketches of her body, her womb, her flesh. He called me not reverend, but doctor, though I hold no such degree. He demanded I witness his discovery. I excused myself quickly, for to linger was to drown in madness." Accounts from enslaved workers are more direct, preserved later in WPA interviews. They tell of Samuel pacing the halls at night, striking the walls with his fists, shouting numbers and measurements. They tell of Marianne's silence, her body swollen, her face unreadable. They tell of children who ran from the house when she appeared, claiming that her eyes reflected not the lamplight but a dull metallic gleam. The confrontation reached its crescendo one storm-heavy evening in August. A letter from a cousin in New Orleans records that Samuel summoned two men from town, physicians, or so he called them. They arrived with valises of instruments. What transpired that night remains uncertain, for the men fled before dawn, leaving their bags behind. One contained a rust-stained scalpel, another a sheaf of notes, scrawled in a hand not their own. On the top page, unfit for incision, flesh-resistant, specimen responds without sound. It is here that Marianne's legend swells beyond the bounds of record. Some accounts say she walked from the house at dawn, still in her cooking gown, and into the cane fields never to be seen again. Others insist she remained, silent and immovable, seated at the hearth until Samuel collapsed before her. What is consistent across every telling is that Samuel was found 3 days later, slumped over his desk, his journals open, his eyes wide and unblinking. Cause of death: apoplexy, though the coroner noted the strange stillness of his face, as if caught between terror and awe. The house passed briefly to distant kin, then fell into ruin. But the confrontation between Samuel and Marianne did not remain confined to Belle Grove. It spread through every parish, retold as warning, as gossip, as parable. For some, Samuel's death was divine retribution, a man who mocked God's law undone by his own obsession. For others, Marianne herself was the agent, enduring humiliation only to exact a vengeance so patient and terrible that it required no blade, no fire, only silence. What matters is not which version is fact, but that every version insists upon confrontation. Samuel's theory could not remain theory. It demanded trial upon flesh. Marianne's silence could not remain silence. It pressed upon him until his mind cracked beneath the weight. The true horror lies not in a scream or a murder, but in the suffocating collapse of certainty, when the body refuses to conform to the categories drawn for it. In the records that remain, diaries,
court ledgers, fragments of newspapers. We see Samuel's voice rise to a fever pitch before breaking. In the stories that linger told by descendants in kitchens and fields, we hear Marianne's silence ring louder than any word. The confrontation was not a duel of equals, but it ended with Samuel in the grave, and Marianne a legend. Belle Grove did not burn that night. It did not collapse in fire or riot. It lingered, stone by stone, absorbing the weight of its shame. By the time the Civil War reached Louisiana, the house was already half abandoned. Soldiers passing through reported a heaviness that pressed upon them, an unease that clung like mildew. Some refused to sleep indoors, choosing the wet ground of the fields over the suffocating quiet of the walls. The confrontation, then, was not merely personal or even familial. It was a fracture that rippled outward, unsettling all who touched the story. Samuel's obsession had promised clarity. Instead it yielded contagion. Marianne's silence had promised nothing. Instead it birthed endurance. The clash between them, whether in storm or in silence, still unsettled. It is this collision between science and superstition, cruelty and endurance, that brings the story to its darkest threshold. For what was born at Belle Grove was not only the ruin of a man, but the unsettling suspicion that humiliation once endured without surrender can outlast reason itself. The ruin of Belle Grove did not conclude with the death of Samuel Rochon. Instead it began. His passing in 1859 was recorded with minimal ceremony, the obituary brief, the coffin plain. No monument marked his grave, no sermon exalted his virtues. What endured were his papers, thick with diagrams, erratic with notations, stained with sweat and, in places, what appears to be blood. The Rochon relatives who inherited the property attempted to cleanse it. They burned some volumes, locked others in chests, and sold the remaining land piecemeal. Yet the writings were like seeds scattered in wind, already copied, already quoted, already moving outward into the veins of academia and pseudo-science. Samuel was gone, but his voice had escaped him. As for Marianne, she remains a question mark scrawled across history. Some records insist she fled into the cane fields, where she was later seen cooking for another household. Others claim she remained in the house until her death, immovable and silent, her body swelling into immensity, her face imperturbable, and in whispers, never written but passed mouth to mouth. The story is darker still, that she did not die but simply stopped being seen. Her body absorbed into the heavy air of Belle Grove, her silence imprinted on the walls. By the Civil War, soldiers spoke of the house in tones of dread. One Union officer wrote that he had found drawings upon the walls, crude and yet deliberate, of faces with no mouth. Another reported dreams so vivid that his men refused to bivouac indoors. After the war, Belle Grove was left to rot. It collapsed slowly, timbers surrendering to swamp and vine, until little remained but foundations and a chimney. Still hunters and trappers swore that the place exhaled unease. The collapse of the plantation mirrored the collapse of memory itself. For decades, Marianne's name survived only in fragments, half-remembered anecdotes, kitchen tales, and whispered warnings to children who wandered too close to the ruins. Samuel's name, meanwhile, appeared in bibliographies, footnotes, medical treatises, and policy drafts. He became abstracted, no longer a man, but a citation, his cruelty bleached into supposed evidence. This was perhaps the greatest horror, that humiliation survived as legend, but cruelty survived as knowledge. Yet both legacies twisted upon themselves. By the mid-20th century, folklorists had reclaimed Marianne as an emblem of endurance. Black writers, particularly in Louisiana, spoke of her as the silent one, who absorbed insult and turned it back upon her tormentor without lifting a hand. And in the academy, Samuel's name grew toxic, his theories dismissed as grotesque pseudoscience, his citations exposed as scaffolding for prejudice. The pendulum had swung, but the shadow remained. And so the story lingers, not as romance, not as tragedy, but as contagion. Every retelling carries the weight of humiliation transfigured into something else, something uncanny, something that resists categorization. In Belle Grove's ruins, silence itself became a presence, a warning that cruelty can never be neatly sealed in archives or graves. Today, the site of Belle Grove is overgrown. No marker commemorates it. Travelers passing by on the levee might glimpse nothing but cane, cypress and ruin. But ask locals, and the story breathes again. They will tell you of a heavy figure seen at dusk, moving through the fog near the riverbank. They will tell you that to speak Samuel's name aloud is to invite a restless echo, and they will tell you always in lowered voice that Marianne waits still, her silence thick as swamp air, her endurance heavier than stone. The true resolution is thus not resolution at all, but Samuel's collapse, Marianne's silence, Belle Grove's ruin. These do not end, they persist, recurring in the half-light of archives and the darker half-light of superstition. What began as a cruel wager in 1854 still coils itself around the South, a reminder that humiliation and cruelty do not vanish. They rot, they ferment, they return. So if you find yourself near the site where Belle Grove once stood, listen carefully. In the cicadas, in the thrum of the swamp, you may hear the sound of papers rustling, though no wind stirs. You may feel the air press against your lungs as though the silence itself were leaning close, and you may wonder whether Marianne has truly gone, or whether she waits, still seated by the hearth of a house that no longer stands, watching, enduring, refusing to be forgotten. Do not linger at Belle Grove. Do not call her name. She may not answer in words, but she will answer in silence, and silence, once it takes hold, does not let go.